Flight 402 was in crisis at 30,000 feet when the captain collapsed, leaving 180 passengers staring death in the face. As panic erupted through the cabin and the co-pilot struggled with failing instruments, a quiet woman in seat 14B stood up. Her hands were steady, her voice calm, but her secret was about to shock everyone aboard. What the passengers didn't know was that their nervous flyer had once commanded fighter jets over hostile territory. And tonight, those forgotten skills would mean the difference between life and death. Sarah Chen pressed her palms against her jeans, trying to stop the trembling that had nothing to do with turbulence. Seat 14B on Flight 402 felt like a prison, every vibration of the Boeing 737 sending shivers down her spine that passengers around her mistook for typical flight anxiety. The businessman beside her offered a reassuring smile, completely unaware that the woman he thought was a nervous flyer had once landed FA-18 Super Hornets on aircraft carriers in 40-foot swells. The irony wasn't lost on Sarah. She'd flown combat missions over Syria, navigated through enemy fire, and executed precision strikes that saved Marine ground units. Yet here she was, white-knuckling a commercial flight like it was her first time in the air. The flight attendant, Jessica, noticed Sarah's apparent distress and approached with practiced kindness. "Everything okay, hun? We should be landing in Chicago in about an hour." Sarah nodded, forcing a smile while her trained eyes automatically scanned the cabin layout, emergency exits, and crew positions, habits from her military days that she couldn't shake even 3 years after leaving the Navy. She'd chosen this aisle seat deliberately, though not for the reasons other passengers might expect. Every detail of the aircraft was familiar to her, from the engine sounds to the subtle changes in cabin pressure. But familiarity bred contempt, and contempt bred the memories she'd spent years trying to forget. The turbulence hit without warning, jolting passengers and sending service carts sliding down the aisle. Sarah's body instinctively tensed, muscle memory from countless carrier landings kicking in as she read the aircraft's movements like a language only she understood. The Boeing was experiencing moderate clear air turbulence, nothing dangerous for a properly maintained aircraft with experienced pilots at the controls. But something felt different this time. The corrections were too sharp, the recovery too delayed. Her trained ear picked up subtle changes in engine rhythm that suggested the flight crew was working harder than they should be for routine weather. Years of flight experience had taught her to trust her instincts, and right now, those instincts were screaming that something was very wrong. Captain Robert Matthews had been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years, his steady hands and calm demeanor legendary among the crew at United Airlines. But as Flight 402 cruised at 35,000 feet somewhere over Iowa, an invisible enemy was already mounting its attack on his cardiovascular system. The chest pain had started as a dull ache during pre-flight checks, something he'd attributed to too much coffee and not enough sleep. Now, as he monitored the instruments and communicated with air traffic control, the pain was becoming impossible to ignore. His left arm felt heavy, tingling spreading down to his fingers as perspiration beaded on his forehead despite the cool cockpit temperature. First Officer Maria Rodriguez glanced at her captain with growing concern. She'd flown with Matthews dozens of times and had never seen him look so pale, his usual confident posture replaced by hunched shoulders and labored breathing. "Captain, you don't look so good," she said, her voice carefully measured to avoid alarming him while expressing genuine worry. Matthews tried to wave off her concern, but as he reached for the radio to acknowledge an air traffic control transmission, the crushing pain in his chest exploded like a bomb, radiating through his entire torso. His vision blurred, his breathing became ragged, and the controls slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers as cardiac arrest claimed one of the airline's most experienced pilots. The cockpit erupted into controlled chaos as Captain Matthews slumped forward, his body weight pushing the yoke and sending the aircraft into an uncommanded descent. Rodriguez immediately grabbed the controls, fighting to level the aircraft while simultaneously calling for medical assistance and declaring an emergency with air traffic control. Her training kicked in, years of simulator sessions and emergency procedures flooding back, but nothing had prepared her for the cascade of failures that began manifesting across the instrument panel. The turbulence that had seemed routine moments before was now magnified by their emergency descent. the aircraft shuddering and bucking as she struggled to maintain control while checking her captain's vital signs and coordinating with the cabin crew. In the passenger cabin, the sudden drop sent people screaming, oxygen masks deploying as the aircraft continued its terrifying descent toward the dark Iowa farmland below. Sarah Chen felt her stomach drop, but not from fear, from recognition. She knew exactly what was happening in the cockpit, could read the signs in the aircraft's behavior like a book written in a language only pilots understood. The descent rate, the engine sounds, the way the aircraft was responding to control inputs, everything pointed to a crew overwhelmed by emergency procedures with possibly an incapacitated pilot. As chaos erupted around her and passengers prayed for their lives, Sarah closed her eyes and made a decision that would change everything. The woman who had spent 3 years running from her past was about to embrace it in the most dramatic way possible. The cabin lights flickered as Flight 402 continued its descent, emergency lighting casting eerie shadows across panicked faces. Sarah unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up, her movement so calm and deliberate that nearby passengers stopped screaming to stare at her. The businessman who tried to comfort her earlier grabbed her arm, shouting over the noise, "Lady, sit down. We're going to crash." But Sarah's expression had transformed completely. Gone was the nervous passenger, replaced by someone whose eyes held the steel of combat experience and the confidence of a warrior who had faced death before and emerged victorious. She gently removed his hand and began moving toward the front of the aircraft with purposeful strides that spoke of military training and absolute determination. Jessica, the flight attendant, was struggling to maintain order when Sarah approached her with an authority that cut through the chaos like a blade. "I need to speak to the cockpit immediately," Sarah said, her voice carrying the command presence that had once directed combat missions over hostile territory. The flight attendant started to protest, explaining that passengers weren't allowed in the cockpit during emergencies, but something in Sarah's demeanor stopped her cold. This wasn't a panicked passenger making irrational demands. This was someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. "Ma'am, I'm a former Navy pilot with over 2,000 flight hours in military aircraft. If your captain is incapacitated, I can help." The cockpit door opened to reveal First Officer Rodriguez, sweat streaming down her face as she fought to control the aircraft with one hand while checking Captain Matthews' pulse with the other. The captain was unconscious, his breathing shallow and irregular, while warning lights painted the instrument panel in ominous reds and yellows. Rodriguez looked up at Sarah with a mixture of desperation and skepticism. Airline procedures strictly prohibited unauthorized personnel in the cockpit, but procedures didn't account for situations like this. "Are you really a pilot?" Rodriguez asked, her voice strained with the effort of managing the emergency. Sarah's response was immediate and professional. "Lieutenant Commander Sarah Chen, former Navy aviator, FA-18 Super Hornet pilot, 1,847 military flight hours including carrier operations and combat missions. I can help you fly this aircraft." The transformation was instantaneous and breathtaking to witness. Sarah slipped into the captain's seat with the fluid grace of someone born to fly, her hands moving across the controls with muscle memory that 3 years of civilian life hadn't erased. She quickly assessed the situation. The aircraft was in a controlled descent but unstable. Multiple warning systems were active, and the first officer was clearly overwhelmed by the cascade of emergencies. "Maria, I've got the aircraft," Sarah announced, using the first officer's name from her uniform tag, establishing the communication protocols that were second nature to her. "Declare emergency with ATC, request immediate vectors to the nearest suitable airport, and prepare for emergency landing checklist. I'll stabilize our descent and get us back to controllable flight parameters." The Boeing 737 responded to Sarah's touch like a thoroughbred recognizing its master. Years of flying high-performance military aircraft had given her an intuitive understanding of aerodynamics and flight control systems that transcended specific aircraft types. She adjusted power settings, trimmed the aircraft for stable flight, and began the systematic process of diagnosing and addressing the various warning systems that had been cascading since the captain's collapse. Her voice remained calm and professional as she coordinated with Rodriguez, their teamwork falling into the natural rhythm that exists between experienced aviators facing a crisis. The passengers, sensing the change in the aircraft's behavior, began to quiet their panic as Flight 402 stabilized under Sarah's expert control. But as Sarah worked to save the lives of 180 souls aboard Flight 402, memories of her last mission flooded back with painful clarity. 3 years ago, she had been leading a strike package over Syria when her wingman's aircraft suffered catastrophic engine failure over enemy territory. She had made the split-second decision to remain with him, providing cover and guidance as he attempted a dead-stick landing in hostile airspace. The mission had been a success. Her wingman survived, enemy targets were eliminated, and no American lives were lost. But the psychological toll of that mission, combined with years of combat stress and the weight of command responsibility, had finally broken something inside her that she thought could never be repaired. The approach to Chicago O'Hare was textbook perfect, Sarah's hands steady on the controls as she configured the aircraft for landing while maintaining constant communication with air traffic control and the cabin crew. Emergency vehicles lined the runway, their flashing lights creating a constellation of hope in the darkness below. As the wheels touched down with barely a bump, 180 passengers erupted in cheers and applause, their lives saved by a woman they had dismissed as just another nervous flyer. Sarah taxied the aircraft to the gate with the same precision she had once used to land on aircraft carriers, her face showing no emotion despite the magnitude of what she had just accomplished. The woman who had spent 3 years hiding from her identity as a warrior had just reminded herself, and everyone aboard Flight 402, that some skills, once learned, are never truly forgotten. As emergency medical teams rushed Captain Matthews to the hospital and passengers disembarked with tears of gratitude in their eyes, Sarah Chen sat quietly in the cockpit for a moment, her hands still trembling. Not from fear this time, but from the realization that she had found her way home. The skills she had tried so hard to forget, the identity she had buried beneath years of civilian life, had emerged when they were needed most. Flight 402 had been saved not by luck or miracle, but by the unwavering dedication of a warrior who had served her country in the skies above foreign battlefields and continued that service in the most unexpected way possible. The passengers would remember this night for the rest of their lives, not just as the evening they nearly died, but as the night they witnessed what true heroism looks like. It doesn't always wear a uniform or carry a weapon. Sometimes it sits quietly in seat 14B, waiting for the moment when duty calls once again. Sarah's story reminds us that the men and women who serve our nation in uniform carry those values with them long after they return to civilian life, ready to answer the call whenever their fellow citizens need them most. If stories like Sarah's inspire you to learn more about the incredible sacrifices and hidden heroism of our military veterans, please subscribe to our channel for more tales of courage, service, and the warrior spirit that continues to protect and serve long after the uniform comes off. These are the stories that deserve to be told, the heroes who deserve to be remembered, and the values that make our nation strong.